In the sweltering heat of September 2006, the emergency room doors at a St. Louis hospital burst open as a young woman stumbled through, clutching what appeared to be a lifeless newborn against her chest. Her face was streaked with tears, her voice breaking as she gasped out words that would haunt medical staff for years to come. "My baby, she's gone. I just gave birth, but she's not breathing." The woman identified herself as Tiffany Hall, and she claimed she had just delivered a stillborn child at Frank Holton Park just moments before racing to the hospital. But as the fluorescent lights of the emergency room cast harsh shadows across her face, something felt terribly wrong. When doctors approached to examine both mother and child, Tiffany recoiled, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "No," she insisted, backing away from the medical team. "You don't need to examine me. Just take care of the baby." The physicians exchanged concerned glances. In their years of experience, they had never encountered a mother who refused medical attention after giving birth, especially under such traumatic circumstances. What those medical professionals couldn't have known was that they were witnessing the final act of a horror story that had been unfolding for days, a story that would soon reveal itself as one of the most shocking crimes ever committed in the American Midwest. At that very moment, as Tiffany Hall stood in that sterile hospital corridor refusing examination, the decomposing bodies of 4 more victims lay hidden in locations around East St. Louis, waiting to be discovered. Among them was Tiffany's supposed best friend, a young mother named Jamela Tunstall, whose brutal murder had set this nightmare in motion. The friendship between Tiffany Hall and Jamela Tunstall began in a way that many childhood bonds do, born of proximity, necessity, and the simple human need for connection in a world that often felt hostile and unforgiving. Growing up in the same rough neighborhood of East St. Louis, Illinois, these 2 girls found in each other what their fractured home lives couldn't provide: stability, understanding, and unconditional acceptance. They called each other sisters, a designation that carried more weight than biology ever could in their young lives. East St. Louis in the 1980s and 1990s was a city grappling with urban decay, poverty, and violence. The once thriving industrial hub had become a symbol of American urban decline, its population hemorrhaging as jobs disappeared, and hope seemed to evaporate like morning mist over the Mississippi River. It was into this environment that Tiffany and Jamela were born, 2 souls who would find solace in each other's company as they navigated the treacherous waters of adolescence in a city that seemed determined to crush the dreams of its youngest residents. Jamela's childhood read like a case study in institutional failure. Shuttled from one foster home to another, she learned early that the only person she could truly depend on was herself. And perhaps Tiffany, who seemed to understand a particular brand of loneliness that comes from never quite belonging anywhere. Despite the chaos of her home life, Jamela possessed an inner strength that manifested in her determination to stay in school, to carve out some semblance of normalcy even as the world around her seemed intent on denying her that basic human right. Tiffany's story, while different in its specifics, shared the same underlying themes of instability and trauma. By age 14, she had already earned a reputation as a troubled youth, her acts of rebellion escalating from mere teenage defiance to genuine criminal behavior. The incident that perhaps best captured the volatility of her young life occurred when she physically attacked her own mother, an act that landed her in the juvenile justice system and earned her the label of delinquent. But those who knew Tiffany understood that her rage was born not of inherent evil, but of deep-seated pain and a desperate need to exert control over a life that felt perpetually out of control. Beverly Cruz, Tiffany's mother, would later recount to reporters the constant state of anxiety that defined their household during Tiffany's teenage years. She spoke of strict curfews imposed and immediately broken, of rules established only to be deliberately violated, of the exhausting cycle of confrontation and consequence that seemed to define their relationship. Perhaps most chillingly, she remembered the night when teenage Tiffany had set their kitchen ablaze. Whether through accident or intent remained unclear, an incident that served as a metaphor for the destructive force that seemed to follow Tiffany wherever she went. Yet through all of this turmoil, the friendship between Tiffany and Jamela endured. They were each other's constants in a world defined by variables, each other's witnesses in lives that often felt invisible to the broader community. When other teenagers were worrying about prom dates and college applications, Tiffany and Jamila were grappling with adult responsibilities and grown-up consequences, bound together by the shared understanding that only comes from walking similar paths of hardship. Motherhood came early for both young women, arriving like an unexpected storm that would forever alter the landscape of their lives. At just 16, each found herself cradling a newborn, thrust into the most demanding role imaginable at an age when most of their peers were still figuring out who they wanted to be. For Jamila, this moment came in 1999 with the birth of her son, Den, a beautiful baby boy who represented both her greatest joy and her heaviest responsibility. The weight of single motherhood in East St. Louis cannot be overstated. With limited resources, minimal support systems, and the ever-present specter of poverty, these young mothers faced challenges that would test even the most prepared adults. Jamila approached motherhood with the same quiet determination that had carried her through foster care and high school. She wasn't perfect. No 16-year-old mother could be. But she was devoted, working tirelessly to provide for Den even as she continued to build her own life. 2 more children followed in quick succession, Ivan in 2003 and Janella in 2004. Each birth brought new challenges and new reasons to fight for a better life. Jamila's small family became her universe. 3 little souls depending entirely on her for survival, love, and protection. The responsibility was overwhelming, but it also gave her life a purpose and structure it had previously lacked. The road wasn't always smooth. There was a heartbreaking period when Jamila temporarily lost custody of her children after authorities deemed her disciplinary methods, using a belt to correct her eldest son's behavior, inappropriate. For a young mother who had grown up in the foster system, the threat of having her children taken away must have awakened every nightmare she'd ever had about abandonment and separation. But Jamila fought back with a determination that surprised even those closest to her. She enrolled in parenting classes, submitted to home visits, jumped through every bureaucratic hoop placed before her. The system that failed to protect her as a child now demanded that she prove her worthiness as a mother, and she met that challenge head-on. When her children were eventually returned to her care, Jamila celebrated not just their reunion, but her own transformation. She had proven to herself and the world that she could be the mother her children deserved, even if she'd never had that example herself. The tax refund that allowed Jamila to purchase her first car represented more than just transportation. It was freedom, independence, and hope made manifest. Behind the wheel of that modest vehicle, she could drive her children to school, to doctor's appointments, to the small adventures that make childhood memorable. She enrolled in community college with dreams of becoming a photographer, imagining a future where she could capture beautiful moments for other families while building financial security for her own. By 2006, Jamila had established a routine that worked for her small family. She was cautious to the point of being overprotective, rarely allowing her children to play outside without supervision. Neighbors grew accustomed to seeing her sitting on a milk crate just outside her apartment door, her watchful eyes following her kids as they played on their little green tractor. A simple toy that brought enormous joy to children who had few material possessions but abundant love. Every morning, without fail, Jamila walked her children to the school bus stop. It was a ritual that spoke to her deep understanding of both the dangers lurking in their neighborhood and the opportunities that education could provide. She had learned through bitter experience that the world could be cruel to children like hers, and she was determined to shield them from as much of that cruelty as possible while still allowing them to be kids. The pregnancy that would ultimately cost Jamila her life began with typical hopes and dreams. At 7 months along, she was eagerly anticipating the arrival of a daughter, already imagining how this little girl might complete their family. She spoke with excitement about the future, about the photographs she would take, about the life she was building brick by brick despite all the obstacles in her path. While Jamila was focused on nurturing life and building a stable future for her growing family, Tiffany's journey through motherhood had taken a far darker turn. Like her friend, Tiffany had become a mother at 16, welcoming her first daughter into a world that she was ill-equipped to navigate. A second daughter followed soon after, but Tiffany's struggles with parenting quickly escalated beyond the typical challenges faced by young mothers. In 1999, the same year that Jamela welcomed baby Den with joy and determination, Tiffany lost custody of both her daughters under circumstances that would haunt her for years to come. The evidence of abuse was unmistakable and heartbreaking. Witnesses described seeing Tiffany's 2-month-old baby limp in her arms, like a rag doll, a phrase that would echo through court documents and social service reports for years. The injuries inflicted on that innocent infant were severe enough to cause permanent damage. By age 7, the little girl still required diapers and struggled with basic communication, speaking in sounds and fragments that only those closest to her could interpret. The physical and cognitive disabilities she would carry for life served as a permanent reminder of the violence she had endured in the first months of her existence. The return of Tiffany's daughters to her care in 2002 came after a decision by state attorneys not to pursue criminal charges for the abuse. The Department of Children and Family Services concluded that Tiffany was no longer a threat to her children, a determination that would prove tragically ironic given the events that would unfold just 4 years later. For Tiffany, regaining custody represented a chance at redemption, an opportunity to prove that she could be the mother her daughters deserved. But even as she worked to rebuild her relationship with her children, Tiffany continued to struggle with the law. In 2002, she was charged with possession of a stolen credit card, another entry in a growing criminal record that painted a picture of a young woman unable to find stable ground in her life. The contrast with Jamela's trajectory was stark. While one friend was building a photography career and creating stability for her family, the other seemed caught in an endless cycle of poor decisions and legal consequences. Despite their diverging paths, the friendship between Tiffany and Jamela remained a constant. Tiffany frequently babysat Jamela's children, a responsibility that Jamela trusted her with despite knowing about her friend's troubled past. This trust spoke to the deep bond between them, a connection forged in childhood that seemed to transcend the growing differences in their adult lives. Jamela believed in the girl she had grown up with, the sister friend who had been her companion through all of life's early storms. The events of September 16th, 2006 began like any other day in East St. Louis, with no indication that before the sun set, 5 innocent lives would be lost and a community would be forever changed. Jamela, heavy with her 7-month pregnancy, made what she thought was a routine visit to Tiffany's mother's home in Belleville. The two friends had made such visits countless times before, catching up on life, sharing the mundane details that fill the days of young mothers trying to make their way in the world. But on this particular afternoon, something had shifted inside Tiffany Hall. Whether it was desperation, mental illness, jealousy, or some combination of factors that had been building for months or even years, she had reached a breaking point that would manifest in unimaginable violence. As Jamela sat unsuspecting in the familiar surroundings of the home where she'd spent countless hours over the years, Tiffany was preparing to destroy everything that had ever mattered to both of them. The attack began suddenly and without warning. Tiffany struck Jamela over the head with a table leg, the heavy piece of furniture becoming an instrument of betrayal in the hands of someone Jamela had trusted completely. The first blow stunned the pregnant woman, but Tiffany didn't stop there. She continued striking her friend repeatedly, each impact driving Jamela closer to unconsciousness and sealing both their fates in an irreversible spiral of violence. When Jamela finally collapsed, her body going limp from the repeated blows to her head, Tiffany began the methodical process of restraining her victim. Using duct tape, a material she had purchased in advance, revealing the premeditated nature of her actions, she bound Jamela's hands and feet, ensuring that even if her friend regained consciousness, escape would be impossible. The same hands that had once comforted Tiffany through childhood traumas were now working to destroy the person who had provided that comfort. In a moment that would haunt investigators for years to come, Jamela did regain consciousness. Bound and helpless, she must have realized the horrifying truth of her situation as she looked into the eyes of her childhood friend and saw not love or recognition, but something cold and predatory. Her desperate attempt to free herself from the duct tape restraints were met with more violence as Tiffany struck her again, this time sealing her mouth with tape to silence her cries for help. The drag from the living room to bathroom must have felt like an eternity for Jamila, her body leaving a trail of evidence that would later help investigators piece together the sequence of events. But even as her life ebbed away from blood loss and trauma, her ordeal was far from over. In that cramped bathroom, surrounded by the mundane fixtures of daily life, a sink, a toilet, a bathtub where children should have been given baths, Tiffany Hall performed an act so barbaric that even seasoned investigators would struggle to comprehend it. Using a pair of scissors that she had purchased specifically for this purpose, Tiffany cut open Jamila's abdomen while her friend was still alive. The medical examiner would later confirm that Jamila was conscious during this horrific procedure, aware as her attacker sliced through skin and muscle to reach the baby she had been carrying with such hope and anticipation. The pain must have been indescribable. But worse still was the knowledge that the person inflicting this agony was someone she had loved like a sister. The baby girl that Tiffany extracted from Jamila's womb was alive at the time of the makeshift cesarean section, her tiny lungs drawing breath in the bathroom where her mother lay dying. But the trauma of the amateur surgery, performed without medical training or proper equipment, proved too much for the premature infant. She died shortly after being removed from the only environment she had ever known, her brief life beginning and ending in violence. With Jamila finally succumbing to blood loss and trauma, Tiffany was left alone with the consequences of her actions. The bathroom, once a place of routine daily activities, had been transformed into a crime scene of unimaginable horror. Blood covered virtually every surface, telling the story of the violence that had occurred there in stark, crimson detail. But instead of calling for help or surrendering to the magnitude of what she had done, Tiffany began the process of covering up her crimes. She wrapped Jamila's body in a shower curtain, the plastic crinkling around her friend's lifeless form as she prepared to dispose of the evidence. The woman who had once been her confidant, her sister in all but blood, was now reduced to an inconvenient problem to be solved. Tiffany dragged the body to a weedy vacant lot behind her house, dumping it like refuse among the urban decay that characterized their neighborhood. The baby girl, the innocent victim whose life had been stolen before it had truly begun, was carefully cleaned and dressed by Tiffany in preparation for the elaborate deception she was about to orchestrate. This tiny body would become the centerpiece of a performance designed to convince the world that Tiffany had suffered a tragic loss rather than committed an unspeakable crime. The call to police that evening was worthy of an Academy Award for its apparent authenticity. Tiffany's voice broke with what seemed like genuine grief as she reported the stillbirth at Frank Holton Park, her story crafted to elicit sympathy rather than suspicion. She spoke of labor pains, of rushing to a secluded area when she realized the baby was coming, of the heartbreak of delivering a child who would never take a breath. To anyone listening, she sounded like a devastated mother experiencing every parent's worst nightmare. The performance continued at the hospital, where Tiffany's refusal to be examined was explained away as trauma and grief. She clutched the dead infant to her chest, tears streaming down her face as she spoke about her loss to medical staff who had no reason to doubt her story. The baby showed no obvious signs of trauma, and premature stillbirths, while tragic, were not uncommon enough to raise immediate suspicions. It wasn't until the autopsy was performed that questions began to emerge. The baby girl showed no signs of the typical distress that accompanies stillbirth, no evidence of conditions that usually cause such tragedies. But without obvious trauma and with Tiffany's consistent story, investigators had little reason to suspect foul play. The infant was released to the morgue, and Tiffany began planning what would be remembered as one of the most bizarre funerals in local history. The funeral arrangements for baby Tiffany Horn, named after her supposed mother, revealed the first cracks in the elaborate facade that Tiffany had constructed. Her behavior at the funeral home was erratic and inconsistent with that of a grieving mother. She arrived 2 hours late to her own child's funeral, a breach of etiquette so severe that the funeral director couldn't help but take notice. Even more telling was her last-minute request to postpone the service so that more family members could attend, despite the fact that only 2 family members had shown up for someone who had supposedly been devastated by the loss of her child. Tiffany seemed remarkably cavalier about the timing of the final farewell. The funeral director, a professional who had seen grief in all its forms, recognized that something was fundamentally wrong with the situation. Among the sparse attendants was Keith Horn, Tiffany's boyfriend, who had returned from Navy deployment specifically to attend what he believed was his daughter's funeral. He had rearranged military commitments and traveled across the country to say goodbye to a child he thought was his own flesh and blood. His genuine grief provided a stark contrast to Tiffany's theatrical performance, highlighting just how deeply her deception had affected those who cared about her. It was Keith who would ultimately unravel the entire horrific truth. In a conversation after the funeral, as he struggled to process his grief and make sense of bizarre circumstances surrounding the baby's death, Tiffany made a comment that would change everything. Perhaps caught up in the momentum of her own lies, or maybe driven by some unconscious need to confess, she casually mentioned that she had cut the baby out of her best friend. The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence, their meaning so incomprehensible that Keith initially couldn't process what he had heard. Cut the baby out of her best friend? What could such a statement possibly mean? As the implications began to dawn on him, Keith felt the world shift beneath his feet. The woman he had loved, the mother of what he thought was his child, had just confessed to an act so monstrous that his mind struggled to accept it as reality. Keith's call to police was made with shaking hands and a voice barely under control. He tried to explain what Tiffany had told him, but the words sounded insane even as he spoke them. How do you tell authorities that your girlfriend claims to have performed amateur surgery on her best friend? How do you convince them that such an unthinkable act might actually be true? But the police took his report seriously, and within hours, they had launched a search for Jamila Tunstall, who had been missing for 6 days without anyone realizing the connection to the strange stillbirth case. The discovery of Jamila's body in the high weeds near Tiffany's home confirmed Keith's worst fears and launched one of the most disturbing murder investigations in the region's history. The decomposition that had occurred over nearly a week made the scene particularly horrifying, but it was a pair of scissors found near the body that provided the most chilling evidence of how she had died. Those ordinary household implements, the kind found in virtually every home in America, had been transformed into instruments of unthinkable brutality. Tiffany's arrest that same night marked the beginning of a confession that will reveal the full scope of her crimes. Sitting in an interrogation room under the harsh fluorescent lights that seemed to follow her from hospital to police station, she began to tell the story of what had really happened on September 16th. But as investigators would soon learn, Jamila's murder was only the beginning of a crime spree that had claimed 5 lives and shattered multiple families. The 3 children, 7-year-old Den, 2-year-old Ivan, and 10-month-old Janella, had been missing along with their mother, but no one had made the connection between their disappearance and the woman who had frequently babysat them. Tiffany's confession revealed that she had picked up the children from their father on September 18th, just 3 days before the funeral she had orchestrated for the baby she had stolen from their mother's womb. The lie she told to obtain custody of the children was as calculated as it was cruel. She informed their father that Jamila wanted her car, and her kids brought to her, a request that seemed reasonable given their close friendship. The man had no reason to doubt Tiffany, who had been a regular presence in the children's lives and had often helped care for them when Jamila needed assistance. What happened next defied comprehension. One by one, Tiffany drowned the 3 children in the same bathtub where she had murdered their mother. Some reports suggested she had drugged them with cough syrup first, making them drowsy and compliant before carrying out her plan. The image of those innocent children, trusting the woman they knew as their mother's best friend, following her instructions to get ready for what they thought was a normal bath, represented a level of betrayal that struck at the very heart of human decency. 7-year-old Den, who had been Jamila's first child and her introduction to motherhood, was old enough to understand danger when he saw it. But he had known Tiffany his entire life, had been cared for by her countless times, had no reason to fear the woman his mother called sister. 2-year-old Ivan and 10-month-old Janella were even more vulnerable. Babies who trusted completely and had no capacity to comprehend the evil that had entered their world. After drowning all 3 children, Tiffany disposed of their small bodies in the same apartment where they had lived with their mother, stuffing them into the washer and dryer like laundry waiting to be cleaned. The symbolism was horrific. Children reduced to objects, their bodies hidden in appliances designed for domestic routine, their final resting place a grotesque parody of the normal family life they had known. For 5 days, those tiny corpses had decomposed in the heat of the laundry appliances while Tiffany went about her life, attending a funeral for the baby she had stolen, accepting condolences for her supposed loss, maintaining the facade of grief while the evidence of her real crimes rotted just miles away. When police finally searched Jamella's apartment on September 22nd, the smell that greeted them was so overwhelming that experienced investigators struggled not to vomit. The discovery of the children's bodies marked the end of Tiffany's deception and the beginning of a community's attempt to comprehend the incomprehensible. How does a neighborhood, a city, a region process a reality that someone in their midst had committed crimes so heinous that they challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature? How do friends and family members reconcile their memories of Tiffany as a troubled but familiar presence with the monster she had revealed herself to be? The funeral for Jamella and her children became a community-wide expression of grief and solidarity. Over 700 people attended the service, many of them strangers who had been moved by the horrific details of the case and felt compelled to pay their respects. The stories shared that day painted a picture of a young woman who had overcome tremendous obstacles to build a loving family, of children who had brought joy and laughter to their small corner of East St. Louis, despite the challenges they faced. People remembered Jamella's bright, childlike smile, the way her face would light up whenever she talked about her kids. They recalled her dreams of becoming a photographer, her determination to create better opportunities for her family, her protective nature that had sometimes seemed excessive but now appeared tragically prescient. The children were remembered for their individual personalities, Den's growing maturity and sense of responsibility, Ivan's toddler energy and curiosity, baby Janella's sweet disposition and infectious giggles. The community's response to the tragedy was overwhelming in its generosity and support. In just 3 days, donations poured in from across the region, raising over $330,000 to cover funeral expenses and support the extended families left behind. This outpouring of financial support represented more than charity. It was a collective rejection of the evil that had been perpetrated against the Tunstall family, a communal statement that their lives had mattered and would be remembered. The legal proceedings that followed Tiffany's arrest were as complex as they were emotionally charged. Initially charged only with the murders of Jamella and her unborn daughter, Tiffany saw additional charges added as investigators uncovered the full scope of her crimes. The decision by prosecutors to seek the death penalty reflected the exceptional nature of the case. The premeditated murder of a pregnant woman and 3 children represented the kind of extreme criminal conduct that the ultimate punishment was designed to address. Tiffany's initial plea of not guilty triggered a psychiatric evaluation that would become central to her defense strategy. The evaluation revealed what many who knew her had long suspected, that she suffered from significant mental health issues that had gone largely untreated throughout her life. Her IQ score in the mid-70s suggested mild intellectual disability, while her history revealed multiple psychiatric hospitalizations dating back to childhood. The appointment of James Gomry, an attorney experienced in death penalty cases, marked a shift in Tiffany's legal strategy. While her mental health issues were acknowledged, the evaluation concluded that she was competent to stand trial and understood the nature of the proceedings against her. This finding meant that her psychological problems, while potentially mitigating factors, would not prevent her from facing justice for her crimes. What distinguished Tiffany's case from other instances of women committing similar crimes was the fact that she already had children of her own. Unlike cases where childless women had stolen babies out of desperate desire for motherhood, Tiffany was already caring for 2 daughters at the time of the murders. This fact made her motivations even more difficult to understand, and her actions even more inexplicable to those trying to make sense of the tragedy. The guilty plea that Tiffany eventually entered on June 9, 2008, brought a measure of closure to the legal proceedings but opened new questions about the adequacy of her legal representation. Her sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole ensured that she would never again pose a threat to innocent children, but it also began a new phase of appeals and legal challenges that would continue for years. Tiffany's attempts to withdraw her guilty plea, beginning just months after her sentencing, were based on claims that her attorneys had provided inadequate representation. She argued that her lawyers had failed to properly investigate her mental health history and had not adequately prepared for psychiatric evaluations that were crucial to her defense. Court documents revealed that key psychiatric reports had been received after her plea was entered, suggesting that important information about her mental state was not available to her defense team when they advised her to accept the life sentence. The psychiatric reports that emerged after her conviction painted a complex picture of a woman whose mental health problems had been severe and long-standing. Diagnoses included psychotic disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, schizophrenia, mood disorder, bipolar disorder, and mild mental retardation, a constellation of conditions that her attorneys argued should have been thoroughly investigated before any plea agreement was reached. The appeals process that followed would stretch across more than a decade, with Tiffany's case winding through various levels of the court system as new attorneys argued that her original representation had been constitutionally inadequate. The complexity of mental health defenses in capital cases, combined with the procedural requirements for post-conviction relief, created a legal labyrinth that seemed to mirror the psychological maze that had led to the original crimes. In 2020, Tiffany finally achieved a measure of success in her appeals when a court granted her petition for post-conviction relief, giving her another opportunity to challenge her conviction and sentence. This victory, while significant from a legal standpoint, offered little comfort to the families and community members who continued to grapple with the trauma of her crimes more than a decade after they were committed. Today, at 42 years old, Tiffany Hall remains incarcerated at Logan Correctional Center in Lincoln, Illinois. Her life now measured not in the potential she once possessed, but in the lives she destroyed and the pain she caused. The appeals process continues, a legal echo of crimes that shocked the community and challenge assumptions about the capacity for evil that can lurk beneath familiar faces. The final chapter of this tragedy was written not in courtrooms or appeals courts, but in a quiet cemetery in Mattoon, Illinois, where Jamila's stillborn daughter was eventually exhumed and reburied alongside her mother and siblings. This reunion in death provided a small measure of peace for those who loved them, ensuring that a family torn apart by violence could rest together for eternity. The case of Tiffany Hall stands as one of the most disturbing crimes ever committed by a woman in American criminal history. It serves as a chilling reminder that evil can wear familiar faces, that trust can be weaponized, and that the bonds we assume are unbreakable can become the very instruments of our destruction. For the community of East St. Louis, for the extended families left behind, and for all who learn of these crimes, the fundamental question remains: how we protect ourselves from those closest to us when they choose to embrace the darkness within. In the end, perhaps the most important legacy of this case is not the legal precedents it set or the appeals it generated, but the memory of 5 innocent lives cut short by unthinkable betrayal. Jamila Tunstall died believing she was visiting a friend. Her 3 children died trusting someone they had known their entire lives. And an unborn baby girl died before she ever had a chance to experience the love that awaited her. Their deaths serve as a stark reminder that evil exists in this world, sometimes wearing the mask of friendship, sometimes hidden behind years of shared history and trust. The question that haunts everyone who learns this story, whether life in prison is sufficient punishment for such unthinkable crimes, ultimately reflects our struggle to comprehend acts that exist beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. In a case where 5 innocent lives were stolen by someone who should have protected them, where trust was used as a weapon and friendship became a tool for murder, perhaps the only adequate response is to remember the victims, support the survivors, and remain vigilant against the darkness that can lurk in the human heart. even in those we believe we know best.